This is Lecture 13, titled The Market Revolution, between 1790 and 1860. Another description for this title is the First Industrial Revolution, an event that really is going to begin in Europe, but of course is going to make its way across the Atlantic Ocean to America. How America becomes an industry-based society, along with our extensive agriculture. And we're going to have what you can call two ways of industrialization. This is the first one. And when I try to think of when they took place, the first industrial revolution took place before the American Civil War in the 1860s, and the second one would take place after that. By the mid-1700s, America was going through some big demographic changes. Remember that the success of America brought about more immigration. A lot of immigrants were coming to America from Europe because it really was a land of opportunity, more so than in Europe, because of unsettled land and new industries. And Americans themselves, through natural reproduction, having large families, and it was a very fast-growing nation. A bulk of the immigrants, because we were getting immigrants from everywhere, in the West Coast we'll get into the Chinese, but I'm going to specifically talk about the East Coast in terms of what we refer to as old immigration. The waves of Europeans that came between 1830 and 1860. That's what I'm referring to in terms of old immigration. Now, a large amount of these immigrants that came from Europe came from the western part of Europe, including the Irish. If you remember, in the 1840s, Ireland went through a terrible potato famine, right? Their potato crops were dying, which a lot of the poor Irish relied on. So that caused many of them to seek refuge here in America. 2 million Irish came to America between 1830 and 1860. The Irish settled in northeastern cities. When you think about Boston and you think of New York, these are cities with huge Irish populations. They worked especially along the shipping yards, the docks. They tended to, with more generations, be involved in police and firefighting forces, and they were also very active in politics. Now, because of their poverty, and because of the fact they were Catholics, they faced a lot of discrimination. Because remember, the majority of Americans were Protestants, and they had this fear of the Catholic Church taking over politics in America, etc. When you look over here at this picture, here's a political cartoon, shall he be allowed to rule America? This fear that the Pope will rule America somehow. The second largest immigrant group that came during old immigration were the Germans. Over 1.5 million came to America between 1830 and 1860. Most of them were uprooted farmers. Again, because of crop failures, they came to America. They tend to settle more into the Midwest. Well, they were in the cities too. A lot of them found their way. They took more chances to acquire land in the Midwest and made successful farms. A large body of voters. They were also known to be big abolitionists. And of course, we got a lot from their culture. They were big into public schools. The kindergarten is actually comes from a German word, because they valued educating the youngest of the children. And of course, other things, like beer. Later on, we're going to get into how some Americans were against alcohol, but beer was very ingrained in their culture. Both the Irish and the Germans were targets of nativism. nativism is a hatred of foreigners. It's hatred and fear of foreigners. This is an expression to describe that Americans that were already living here hated, feared old immigrants, or immigrants in general, because they felt there was a threat to their way of life. An example of nativism in America, in 1849, an organization known as the Know Nothing Party was created with the purpose of trying to get politicians to limit immigration and citizenship. Okay, it was a nativist organization, a political organization to try to limit immigration and naturalization, which is the citizenship of America. And again, we have another nativist political cartoon right here, where you could see this would represent the German and the Irish, walking away with a ballot box. So now let's specifically talk about the Industrial Revolution. We know it began in Europe. People used to make goods, industrial products at home with their own hands and tools. So industrialization is this movement to where inventors, engineers made large-scale, complex machines and started putting them into factories full of labor that then started making products, more products, cheaper products for society. This is the process of industrialization. It began in Europe, and as those ideas and designs came to America, industrialization is going to take off in America. So this is industrialization. When we refer to the market revolution, it just refers that America will produce goods and trade, create a true market with other nations around the world. And we're going to be a part of it. So this is this market revolution, trade amongst other nations in terms of industrial goods. Now, I kind of gave you a memory aid in case you ever need to quickly brainstorm. First Industrial Revolution, what was that about? Okay, the T represents the primary good that they were making in these first factories, and that's textiles. That's cloth products, right? Clothes, drapes, all kinds of cloth products. The R stands for, with industrialization, it's going to spark other types of revolutions, like transportation revolutions. The R stands for the first railroads are going to come out of this industrial period, and mostly in the northern parts of America, to ship a lot of these industrial goods. And by the way, in America, the textiles will be made in the north, and we'll talk about this regional specialization, because the South is all about plantations. The I stands for the metal that a lot of these machines were made of, and the railroad tracks, that is iron. Okay, steel is not going to be made in mass production until the second industrial revolution. And then the C stands for the fuel, the energy. The energy of the first industrial revolution is steam power. We learned about James Watt in world history. And in order to make steam power, you've got to burn coal. So this is the memory aid: textiles, railroads, iron, coal, of the first industrial revolution. An important person, Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater would be called the father of the factory system in America. The father of the factory system. Because he built the first spinning jenny in America, which was a complex machine that would spin the material that you needed for your textiles, whether it be cotton or wool, etc. So there's a spinning jenny. There's a picture of Samuel Slater, and of course the use of his spinning jenny in mass production. So this is what made Samuel Slater the father of the factory system, by bringing the spinning jenny to America in 1791. Now, I talked about how steam power would be the primary source of energy. But the very first factories, just like in Europe, if you look at this picture down here, they used to be powered with water wheels, the rivers. Okay, those were the first ones, until we got to the more efficient steam power. Another important figure in the American market revolution was Eli Whitney, an American engineer that invented something that's going to be a game changer. He invented the cotton gin in 1793. Now, the most valuable material for textiles was cotton, because it was cool in the summer and it could still be warm in the winter. But cotton was difficult to turn into textiles. The biggest issue was the seeds in the cotton had to be removed, and it was very laborious. It was very time consuming. So his invention was a game changer, the cotton gin in 1793. And we see a picture of it over here on the right. This was a machine that removed the cotton from the seeds. And I describe it as a game changer for this reason. And maybe the unintentional outcome, Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Think about the South for a minute. Think about the South and how they were very invested in tobacco plantations, rice plantations, etc. Well, tobacco production was on the decline. Okay, it was a product that really depleted the soil, and the demand was not as strong. Other nations were growing tobacco. So with the invention of the cotton gin, the South went from tobacco plantations to cotton plantations. And in the turn of the century, in the late 1800s, it even looked like the institution of slavery was no longer going to be needed. Well, that changed with the cotton gin. With the cotton gin and now the tobacco plantations turned into cotton plantations, the South would rely even more on slave labor until the Civil War. Another industrial invention that Eli Whitney gave us was the concept of interchangeable parts. If we're going to make complex machines or goods, let's make the parts first and then put them together in the factories. This was an innovative concept that's really going to help the Industrial Revolution as well. This Industrial Revolution will spark other revolutions. In order, for example, if we're going to make these goods, mass produce these goods, we have to have improved ways of transportation and we have to have improved ways of communication. An example of how the Industrial Revolution improved communications was Samuel F.B. Morse, who invented the telegraph. Another huge invention, an important piece of technology, because in the business world, you've got to communicate quickly, more efficiently. And now, as you know, you've heard of Morse code, the telegraph wires where people can quickly communicate and do business. Of course, this would greatly advance American communication. Now, when we talk about industrial production in the factories, let's take a quick look at labor. Who worked in the factories? Well, the first factories, an example of an early factory, of a true factory, it was a dual textile process plant. It would spin the yarn, or it would spin the threads, and then weave it into textiles. An early example of a factory in America was created by Francis Cabot Lowell in Massachusetts, 1823. He was, again, the first one to build a dual-purpose textile plant. And the labor that he used was quite interesting. He went around, again, in Boston, in the area of Boston, the area of Massachusetts, and he recruited the daughters of farmers. And, he promised to put them up and he put them up into dorms, had them attend churches. He had women overseers to kind of look out for them and protect them. And this experiment in terms of labor and factory production, his workers were known as the famous Lowell Girls. This was an early example. And again, this first factory, this was near water. But I can't say enough how steam power is going to really change this. So now they're going to put the factories, because of steam power, you can move them to the bulk of your labor. They're going to move the factories to the cities. And in the cities, you've got lots of immigrants. So the little girls, again, was an experiment. That's not going to be who's going to dominate the factories. Farmers' daughters are not going to dominate it. There will be a lot of women, but there's going to be a lot of immigrants. Immigrant women, men, and even children, as factory production is going to explode in Eastern American cities. Because of steam power, that's where you have, we'll talk about these northern workers and the traditional factory. This is going to be a part of American landscape in the eastern cities, like in Europe. To the right, and this is where the immigrants would find their way to works and jobs. And look over to the right, children were a big piece to this puzzle as well, especially in those textile machines. They had the small hands, they had the access in between the machines to get in there and work. And of course, we'll talk about how this is going to have a huge impact on the cities, how they're going to grow, how the workers, they're not going to have rights to unions. So, life will be very difficult for them. They're going to work long, hard hours under very unsafe conditions in these cities. We'll talk about stratification as well. Now, with the technology and the innovations that went into textiles, the technology and the innovations will spark our agricultural production in America as well during this same time period. The Trans-Allegheny region, which is basically the old Northwest in America at the time, we're talking about states like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Their agricultural output would just explode. They're going to make a lot of food. And at first it was the middle colonies in America, and then we have the Northwest. A lot of those regions we talked about as being the breadbasket of America. But in the market revolution, this region, the Trans-Allegheny region, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, would become the breadbasket of the world. We're going to trade, we're going to sell wheat, corn, and these types of things to other nations as we get involved in this market revolution. And when we talk about innovators, technology, improvements in technology, etc., that help that, John Deere. We like to associate him a lot with the American tractor, but not invented in the early 1800s. John Deere made his mark because he invented the first steel plow, which we can see over here on the right. Steel plow, P-L-O-W, which would, again, help our agricultural production. Another inventor that helped in this explosion of agricultural output, Cyrus McCormick, an American inventor who invented, we call this the mechanical reaper, R-E-A-P-E-R. The mechanical reaper, R-E-A-P-E-R. With the tremendous production of industrial goods, textiles, with the production of agricultural goods, we're going to see that industrial revolution also create a transportation revolution in America. Again, in between the early and mid 1800s. We're going to see, for example, and this is a very basic transportation revolution, okay? This is not cars or even a full-out production of trains. Trains would be a part of it, but a small part of it. We're going to see the first use of turnpikes, which is not paved, but carved out roads in which people would charge people for access to roads. So we're going to turnpikes is the use of roads for people to transport themselves, their goods, etc. The Cumberland Road is a good example of this movement to mass produce roads. The Cumberland Road was called the National Road, built in 1811, which connected Maryland, which was in the coast, all the way to Illinois, which was in the Midwest. So it was a national road. It connected, at that point, an eastern city to the Midwest to move goods and move people. And how did people make their journeys and to settle out west? On the Conestogas. This is your traditional, over here to the right, covered wagons. Now, that was a big part of the transportation revolution. Now, another big part of the transportation revolution is taking advantage of American rivers and lakes. And there was two ways that we did that. Robert Fulton in 1807 introduced to America steamboats. Large boats that could now take advantage of the large rivers in the Northeast, that take advantage of the Mississippi River for the shipment of people and goods. Another development on the water, the introduction of man-made canals would also be part of this transportation revolution. Because understand, with the steamboats on the rivers, with the introduction of canals, American farmers, American textile producers, you can now move goods faster, more efficiently. And a lot of these canals connected the rivers and the lakes in the Northeast. A perfect example of that is the Erie Canal, completed in 1825. And when you look over here to the right, we have examples of these connections. The centerpiece right here is the Erie Canal. And look at the way it connected all these waterways and connected all these people and towns to move goods, especially agricultural goods. And again, the beginning of something that would just grow at a tremendous number in America, railroads. The first American railroads were during this market revolution. Look over to the right. This is what the first railroads look like. Okay, very primitive. On iron railroad ties, etc. And let me stress, the bulk of these railroads were built in the Northeast, in the shipment of the food products, industrial goods, coal, etc. And that's really going to be an advantage to the North, whereas the South was slow to develop railroads when we eventually get to the Civil War. Now, let's take a look at the impact of industrialization of the first industrial revolution or the market revolution. We're going to see regional specialization. That means the different regions of America would invest and be known economically for distinct areas. When it came to the Northeast, it was all about industrial production. Okay? It was textiles. It was factories. This is what the Northeast would be known for, business and trade. Also banks. I want to stress that as well. When it comes to the South, so this picture represents the Northeast. When it comes to the South, you come over here to the right, and it's all about cotton plantations. And they're going to invest a lot into the cotton plantations. And let me stress this about the South. They're not going to be very flexible. They're not going to be very diverse. Whereas the Northeast, yes, there was industrial output, but they also had access to food products. Whereas the South invested almost everything into cotton plantations, and that's going to hurt them eventually. The western part of the United States was about growing food, agriculture and farming. That's what we have down here. So, and again, I forgot to mention this one connection too. Those southern plantation owners, they used a lot of the northern banks. So this is what America looked like because of the first industrial revolution. Now, another impact of industrialization, the American city is going to grow in huge numbers. Before industrialization, most Americans were farmers and small farmers. So industrialization is really going to change the look of America. The cities, more Americans will live in the cities than not in the cities. It would be full of immigrants. It would be full of the common man, laborer, worker. And we'll talk about, the good and the bad that came with the growth of cities. It would be a place of technology eventually. It would be a place of work. It would be a place of entertainment, the American city. But it would also become places that were overcrowded with poverty and crime and dangerous conditions. Fires would break out, and cities weren't really prepared to handle some of these issues. Unsanitary conditions in the cities as people were overcrowded. It was hard to find clean drinking water. We had diseases like cholera that were breaking out. So this growth of cities had both its negative and positive impact on America. Now, when we look at gender issues, there would be more economic opportunities for women. Okay, women would find more opportunities at work because of the growing cities. Now, another element that you will see really in all of these regions is this continual social stratification, social and economic stratification. There would be a gap in wealth. That's what we mean by social stratification. The people that own the factories, and then there was the workers, right? A huge gap. The people that own the plantations, the small farmer or the slaves themselves, a huge gap. The same with the farmers that own the huge farms in the West and the family farms that were just trying to go away. And this would be a continual issue that America would have to deal with. So now let's go into our themes. In this section, the first industrial revolution, the market revolution, analyze the impact of immigration between 1820 and 1860 on American society. Okay, why did the immigrants come? What did they do here in America? How did they add to American culture? And of course, what was the reaction of the nativists to them? Number 2, analyze the impact of the transportation revolution on the American economy between 1790 and 1860. And maybe I didn't say it specifically, but the two go hand in hand, industrialization and transportation. Be able to describe that connection and why they're important to one another. The third one, analyze the ways that economic developments in antebellum America resulted in regional specialization. Be able to describe that regional specialization.